Welcome and thank you for standing by. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be posted publicly. If you have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. Now, I'd like to turn the call over to Erlene Dow. Erlene, you may begin.
Thank you, Greg. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the October Local Employment Dynamics, or LED, webinar. On behalf of the U.S. Census Bureau and the LED Partnership, in collaboration with the Council for Community and Economic Research and the Labor Market Information Institute, it is my pleasure to welcome a past LED workshop presenter, Gail Krumenauer, as she presents Impacts of the Pandemic Recession and Reemployment in Oregon. The acute onset and depth of the pandemic recession was unlike anything seen previously in Oregon. What was a healthy economy lost 286,000 jobs in 2 months' time. The impacts were not evenly distributed, with in-person service-based sectors experiencing significantly higher rates of job loss. 2 years after the pandemic recession, Oregon's labor market had seen a remarkable turnaround. A rapid jobs recovery brought unemployment near record lows again. 7 out of 10 pandemic recession unemployment benefit claimants in Oregon were back on the job by winter 2022, and they had experienced an increase in median wages. Krumenauer covers how these large and relatively fast swings in Oregon's economy have impacted different sectors and workers across different demographics who lost and found jobs. Gail Krumenauer joined the Employment Department in 2009 and currently serves as Oregon's state employment economist. In this role, she focuses on industry trends across Oregon and current labor market issues affecting workers and employers. Her career includes experience working in private, nonprofit, and government organizations. She holds a master's degree in economic analysis and public policy from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and a bachelor's degree in communication from arts from DePaul University. Gail enjoys running, traveling, cooking, coaching, and gardening. With that, I welcome Gail.
Thank you, Erlene, for the really kind introduction, and to everyone for being here today. I am excited to share this work on behalf of our whole team in the research division of the Oregon Employment Department. This really is the culmination of 2 years worth of special project research on the side of all of the other things that we do. And so I really want to say thanks to the team for spending so much time doing so much in-depth work for this project and the ability to share it here at the Local Employment Dynamics webinar in partnership with C2ER. So the first thing
Gail, we can't hear you.
Okay, I was unmuted and then I muted and then I unmuted again. Am I good?
You are good.
Okay, let's hope it sticks this time. Why did I go backwards and start that again? I'm so sorry. Okay, so thanks to Erlene for the wonderful introduction, and for everyone on our team who has spent not 1 but 2 years doing this special research on the side of all of our regular things. And I'm glad to finally actually be heard telling you that we're so excited to share our findings as a part of the Local Employment Dynamics webinar in partnership with C2ER. So hopefully we're all seeing the slide where we're taking that first look of context at what happened in Oregon in the spring of 2020. And that's that we lost 282,000 total non-farm payroll jobs, which was 1 out of 7 jobs for us in our state. It's really similar to what happened across the nation as well. But I do come back to set the context here because as often as I look at this, I find that I am consistently amazed at just how much happened and how rapidly in that initial downturn and really ever since. So what we're doing here to try to identify the disparate impacts of the pandemic recession is first look at, in this visual, the bars that are moving furthest to the left are the largest share of all jobs that were lost in sectors. So we want to see who's really losing an outsized share relative to that 1 out of 7 jobs I'm talking about. And that's leisure and hospitality, other services, and private education. And then if you look back up at the top of the visual, you can see that there were a couple of sectors, one including local government, which for us has public K-12, community colleges, and public higher education, all in local government, which after the initial job losses kept losing jobs. So we took a look at those to see what sectors we thought might be most heavily impacted. And then we turned to the quarterly workforce indicators to try and help us take that into a different perspective, not just what sectors are losing jobs, but what workers, what people are being more heavily impacted by this downturn and those job losses. And so we looked across this for all the demographics that we could. Unfortunately, we didn't have in our own systems to come back for comparison later. We didn't have, we were missing the large majority of all of the race data when we get to the claimants. So that's something that couldn't be a part of our analysis, but we were able to get it for ethnicity. So that will be included. But we looked for all the demographics that we could, which is basically everything but race. And said, okay, in those more heavily impacted sectors, what do the demographics look like there? And so in the first set of grouped bars, you can see that it's younger workers, those ages 14 to 24. They held about 11% of all jobs in Oregon heading into the pandemic recession, but held more than 1 out of 4 jobs in leisure and hospitality, which lost about half of its employment. So we flagged that as something that could have a disparate impact to those workers. The next group in the middle there is women. So women held 2 out of 3 jobs in education, that's public and private combined in Oregon prior to the pandemic recession. Women also had a slight majority of jobs in leisure and hospitality and in other services. And then in this third set of bars that you see, we're looking at workers of Hispanic or Latino origin, who made up about 12% of Oregon's labor force, but made up about 17 or 18% of leisure and hospitality. And given the scale of the losses in that sector, we flagged that as something that we expected to see a disparate impact to. The quarterly workforce indicators are really enhancing the view from our own wage records. They're the wage records that we get from employers telling us who worked for them each quarter, how much they earned, how many hours they worked. And the Census Bureau gives us, the enhanced demographics for it. If we're looking just at our own wage records here, which is for the second quarter of 2020, for stable jobs, so those who'd been working at least 1 full quarter in Oregon's workforce before spring of 2020, we see another disparate impact that we expect to see when we move over to the claims, and that's low wage workers. And it intuitively kind of makes sense that low wage workers would be more heavily impacted because leisure and hospitality was so heavily impacted, and it has the lowest average hourly earnings of any sector in Oregon, the highest share of minimum wage jobs. So we expected that. But what you see here is actually it was pretty even across the board in leisure and hospitality. But those bright bars that are sticking out further to the left, that's the lowest 1/3 or lowest tercile of workers in every single sector in Oregon had the steepest job losses in the pandemic recession. And to be fair, lower wage earners, the bottom 1/3 of earners, would more typically lose or leave jobs every year, either due to layoffs, retirements, long-term seasonal work ending, moving out of state, or things like that. But we looked at a baseline of the year before that, and the lower wage workers were impacted to an even greater disproportionate degree than the middle and top third earners during the pandemic recession. So those who earned the least were most likely to lose their jobs. And the impacts to the lower wage earners, those matter, along with the things that I flagged in terms of the QWI, as we turn the page to looking at unemployment claims. And specifically in terms of lower wage earners, I'm thinking about how on average they have less in savings or may have less of a financial safety net, meaning that jobless benefits could be of outsized importance for their ability to make ends meet. So we did what I said, went and took a look in the unemployment insurance claims that we had from those first couple months of the pandemic. And what you see here, again, we're going to start from the left and work our way across, is that prior to the pandemic, women had about 40% of regular unemployment insurance claims in Oregon. They made up 47% of the labor force, so they were kind of underrepresented in those claims. In the early months of the pandemic recession, they actually jumped to be a slight majority of all unemployment insurance claims. So we did see a disparate impact there, greater than their pre-pandemic baseline and greater than their share of the labor force. If we move on to looking at the second highlighted bar, the younger workers, we can see that prior to the pandemic, they had a lower share also of regular unemployment insurance claims relative to their labor force, their share of the labor force. And they came up in line with their share of the labor force, so a greater share of all claims during those early pandemic months. Now, we did not see a larger share of pandemic era claims in those early months from workers of Hispanic or Latino origin. Their share of regular unemployment insurance claims actually went down. During the pandemic, we also had this one-time look that we could take at people who were self-employed, contractor gig workers, those who don't otherwise qualify for regular unemployment insurance benefits. And they're also not in our wage records or in the records that we share with the Census Bureau. So we get to take this one-time look at this set of workers and see what the impacts were to them too. So pandemic unemployment assistance or PUA claims were the types of claims that applied to these workers. And again, we see that women had an outsized share of those claims relative to their share of the labor force. Younger workers did not. They had a smaller share of those claims than their share of the labor force, which makes sense to me because I don't think of self-employment necessarily. And about 8 out of 10 of those types of claims were people who were self-employed. I don't think of self-employment as something that's maybe somebody's first job out of the gate, perhaps more typical later on in one's career. So that kind of made sense. But again, we saw this underrepresentation of pandemic PUA claims by Hispanic or Latino workers, which compared to what we knew in terms of business ownership statistics, didn't quite make sense. So we're going to talk about that more in just a minute. But before that, I want to come back and check the other theory that we were looking at, which was that lower wage workers would be harder hit. And what we're looking at here is the average base year, or it's pretty much the annual or prior 4 quarters before you file a claim. What those basically annual earnings look like. And you can see that as soon as the first public health and safety measures are announced, the earnings of those who are coming in the door and getting unemployment insurance benefits, it drops by 20%. And it stayed that way for the entirety of the pandemic unemployment programs era. So unemployment insurance really did appear to be a safety net for those who were earning less in Oregon. So coming back to the Hispanic or Latino workers, we went through kind of this thought process again and thought, why would they be underrepresented in the regular and the pandemic claims? And it could be several things, and we don't know exactly what happened. But we thought maybe perhaps they were less likely to lose their jobs in the first place. Or it could be an issue of scale. I'm talking about women holding 2/3 of jobs in education, and they also make up about half of the labor force. So when you combine those two things together, just the math, the scale of the impact to them would kind of show up in those results. And maybe with the Hispanic or Latino workforce making up, 12% of the labor force and 17 or 18% of leisure and hospitality, maybe that's not the same scale to get that kind of impact that we would necessarily see in terms of overall claims, right? But it could be something else. If we go back to that time in, March and April of 2020, so Oregon's, most people would file a claim using our online claim system. And it had some Spanish language, no other languages, just in the first few screens, which isn't the most detailed or technical part of the application process. And after that, it's just all in English. And so if perhaps you needed assistance in another language, you could call us. We've had language assistance for years if you could get through. So Oregon has about 4 million people, a little over 4 million people, and took 20 million inbound calls to our unemployment insurance lines just in April of 2020. So if you needed to talk to somebody to get help, that was tough. If you couldn't get through to us on the phone, perhaps you could come to one of our WorkSource offices and maybe find somebody who could help you, except it was a pandemic and they were closed to the public, as were public libraries. And the employment department did make great strides translating all of the unemployment application materials into 15 languages and holding webinars with live simultaneous translation in 4 languages. But that didn't happen right away. That happened a handful of months down the line. And with such an abrupt recession that also had a really sharp bounce back at the beginning, there were some people who perhaps entirely missed the opportunity for these safety net benefits just because of access. So that is possible. And in terms of the Hispanic or Latino workforce, we wanted to see if we could try to put some data to that. And this is from the Census Bureau, but it's not LED data. It's from the American Community Survey, which we pulled it out of IPUMS, looking at limited English proficiency. So just before the pandemic recession, 2019, 6.2% of Oregon's workforce had limited English proficiency. If we look at the Hispanic or Latino workforce, it's 31%. Similarly, it's also a higher share for those of some other race or Asian, Native American, or other Pacific Islanders. So that doesn't necessarily tell the whole story, but it does lend to the idea that there could have been access issues that disparately impacted that group of workers if they lost their job. So that takes us through the first set. This is the first year through April of 2021 of the research that we did looking at who may have been impacted the most in terms of the pandemic recession job losses. Then we come another year forward and we freeze as of April 2022. And we've seen a dramatic reversal. So what you see on the visual here is that the sharper the line goes down, the deeper the job losses, and you don't get back to as many job losses as you had before the recession until you're back at 100. And Oregon had regained, so by 2 years after losing 1 out of every 7 jobs, we'd already regained 9 out of 10 of those that were lost. So that was a pretty remarkable turnaround. And actually, as of August, Oregon had regained all of the 282,000 jobs that were lost. By comparison, it took us more than 6 years to recover from the Great Recession. So a really sharp bounce back. And this and the next few slides, we'll talk about more of that context and then take a look at this is the environment that those people who lost their jobs are coming into as they are looking for their next opportunities. So even though all of those total non-farm jobs have come back in Oregon, they didn't all fall into the same places that they disappeared from, right? So just a little more context in terms of the leading sectors. They're really, as of spring 2022, I know some of these are already having changes that are happening to them now. But as of spring 2022, the sectors leading the recovery really had homes and residences as a common thread, either like those who work in professional or technical services, more likely to be able to work from home for those jobs, and we're less likely to lose them in the first place for that. Or transportation, warehousing, and utilities, which really just surged as people got more things delivered to their doors. It was already a trend that was increasing, particularly in the fourth quarter, but really kind of year round. And it just surged since then and has just kind of started leveling off at a much higher level in Oregon. And then construction, which really the surge there has been in residential construction and in those specialty trades, the plumbers, the carpenters, the roofers, the people who do home repairs really have seen a strong recovery period, as has, again, STAR, because it's through the spring of 2022, real estate and rental and leasing. The lagging sectors, and I think of this in terms of the folks who lost their jobs, some of those are the same ones that were the hardest hit in the first place. So leisure and hospitality, even as of September, we just released the jobs report for this morning and within the last hour, has regained 9 out of 10 jobs that were lost, but still nominally is the furthest behind of any sector in terms of recovering its pandemic job losses. So leisure and hospitality is still lagging behind. Local government, again, it started to pick up more recently, but really lagged behind. And in Oregon, public education and most of private education too was much slower to open up. We didn't fully reopen to in-person instruction until September of 2021. So that was one of the last pieces of Oregon's economy to fully reopen. And then another one I wanted to point out was healthcare, which had been running ahead of the overall recovery until about the middle of 2021. And a lot of that nursing and residential care facilities really hasn't seen much in any way of rebound. And it's been offset by a great recovery in terms of doctors and specialist offices, but the hospitals were kind of different. We really saw some different impacts happening there during those Delta and Omicron waves that kind of brought healthcare down a little bit. Backing back up to the overall recovery, with the rapid regaining of all those jobs, we see unemployment come down near record lows again. And again, in terms of the context for workers who are looking for jobs, it's become a pretty fiercely competitive labor market in Oregon and across the US. We've actually seen that be even more exacerbated by the fact that even before Oregon had regained all of the total non-farm jobs, we already had a larger labor force than we did before the pandemic recession, which is different than the US. We're running a little different trend there. A larger labor force and more people who are employed in Oregon now than before the pandemic recession. And that was true before we regained all the total non-farm job losses. And a piece of that is that self-employment is a greater share of the labor force now. It's about at the highest point that it's been since about 2016. And it's a growing share as opposed to a declining share like it was before. So, in addition, so people are just really, they're having different opportunities to pursue gig or freelance work. And Oregon is also one of the highest states in terms of the share of people who work from home. So more people could potentially be working remotely for a business based in another state or place here too than they were in 2019 as well. And that puts a squeeze on those employers who are trying to hire or rehire people as well. Another squeeze on them is that unemployment, which is it's 3.8% in Oregon as of September, but the number of unemployed people is about as low as it was in 2019, except this is just for private employers in Oregon. They're trying to fill about twice as many job openings now as they were the last time unemployment was this low. And so all of these factors are kind of coming together, and we're seeing record difficulty for employers filling their job vacancies. Over the past year, 7 out of 10 job openings have been identified as hard to fill by them. So all of this comes together again in the context to think about those Oregonians who lost their jobs in the pandemic recession. We went back in again in the second year's research and said, okay, what happened to them? What are their labor market outcomes? Where did they go? And the most common outcome was that they returned to their employer. So one of the hallmarks of the pandemic recession is that in Oregon, about 9 out of 10 layoffs were temporary, as opposed to the Great Recession, which I kind of showed that comparison before. Those were almost entirely permanent job losses. So there was this kind of spring back when things reopened, and many employers were able to bring back the workers that they had idled. And so this looks just at the regular unemployment insurance claimants, because again, those other ones fell out of our records again once the pandemic claims ended. So we're taking a look at, for those who lost their jobs in the pandemic recession in those early weeks, where are they by winter of 2022? So that first quarter. And so the universe of claimants here is about 418,000. And the most common outcome, they went back to their employer. 36% of them went back to and still worked for the same employer that had laid them off by winter of 2022. 1 out of 4 had completely switched to a different sector of the economy. 12% of them had stayed in the same sector but switched to a different employer. And I know this looks like a really big number, but about 3 out of 10 had disappeared completely from our wage records. And that's actually, so it's a much larger number because of the size of this cohort, but it's a typical share. We went back and looked at a cohort who had been unemployed during the same period of the year in 2016, which was right on the heels of the strongest jobs expansion or strongest job growth during the last expansion. And similarly, in that group, 3 out of 10 weren't in our wage records 18 months after that job displacement either. And these are people who retire, they take a job in another state, they take time out of the labor force to take care of their family. So that's, even though it's a much bigger number for this cohort, it's a similar share to what we've seen in the past. Looking at the reemployment trends for men and women, we mentioned before that women had much larger impacts in terms of those very initial job losses. They did have also that outsized share of unemployment claims. Their reemployment trends don't look significantly different from the overall trend or significantly different from men's. So we didn't see anything really shocking in that just top line view there. We did see notable trends and differences by unemployment claimants' age, though. So those who were under 25 years old were far more likely to completely switch to a different sector of the economy. 41% of them had moved on, gone from working maybe in a restaurant to a warehouse between the time they lost their job and the winter of 2022. Conversely, workers who were 55 years and older who were laid off and claimed unemployment insurance, almost half of them went back to and were still with the same employer by the winter of 2022. We also saw significant variation in recall and retention by sector. I took out some of the sectors here that looked pretty similar to the overall trend to try and not have so many lines to look at here. But what we see is that there were 3 sectors that were more likely to bring back and keep their workforce after those pandemic recession layoffs. Those were education services, public administration, and manufacturing. And the ones who had the largest share who switched employers within the same sector were leisure and hospitality and healthcare and social assistance. And then the largest share who had those who left for different sectors completely were information, administrative and waste services, and utilities. One of the things I want to call out at the top of this with education services is that there's a data quirk here. There were federal changes to the work share program under the CARES Act that was passed in the spring of 2020. And what that did was our work share program is if your hours are reduced by 20 and 40%, you can get unemployment insurance to offset those losses, but also you get to keep your job. And several of the largest school districts in Oregon did just that. So in that education services bar there, that 71%, the number of education workers that accounted for the total regular claims, they were about 12% of it, but they were 59% of work share during the same period. So that's skewing that number high. They actually still have jobs and also are counted in unemployment here. So that's something that's kind of quirky. The manufacturing, that happened a little bit in public administration too. It was a slightly outsized share of work share, but like maybe 5 percentage points, nothing like what we saw in education. One of the things I wanted to highlight, coming back to the younger workers, is that the larger share of younger workers who were laid off and moved to other sectors, I think could be having a bit more of an impact in that leisure and hospitality sector, where we're seeing slightly larger movements to a different sector. And leisure and hospitality is one of those sectors where it seems like, at least in the reemployment period, they're really competing on wages. There's been, there's less in the way of benefits or other things. And so I think the combination of some of the dynamics in that sector and the dynamics of its workforce could be impacting how the distribution is in what happened in terms of reemployment there. Quickly looking at sectors where pandemic recession claimants were likely to move on. I don't really want to overplay these too much because utilities and information, their shares are huge, right? But altogether, they make up 1.5% of all of the unemployment insurance claimants in this period. So it's a really small number. It's just a couple of hundred, but it looks, really big. And then in administrative and waste services, again, a really large share that moved on to other sectors. Administrative and waste services has a lot of employment services, and employment services and temp help by design is meant to help people get jobs largely in other sectors. So there wasn't anything too dramatic in terms of some of those look big, but they're not really as huge as they might seem. And this is kind of an example because the timeframes don't sync yet, but I wanted to bring back another LED piece into this, right? Because we can take a look at what happened to the claimants, and then it would be really great for us to be able to take a look at that in comparison with what happened. You know, what did job-to-job flows look for all workers? So this is just kind of like a hypothetical and would be really fun to bring back later with the added demographics once the timeframes sync, because I think we're still 2 quarters ahead in Oregon of where the job-to-job flows data is in terms of what we did for this comparison versus the timeframe that job-to-job flows is available. But it would be kind of fun to be able to take a look at this, and you can kind of see as you look down the line that this is just an example of where workers landed after a brief spell of non-employment, and a lot of them landed similarly back in the same sector. And you can see, you know, what the leakages maybe look like to other sectors, where I'm looking at the education piece right here. The origin sector that they lost their job from is on the left, and that they left a job from, and then where they ended up is the top one. And in education, you see it's almost, you know, completely blank up and down the column. So very little leakage, not to the extent that we see in our numbers. But it's just a really interesting potential thing that we could look at then with gender and age and things like that. So it's pinned for me as a point of future research once the timeframes are synced. I wanted to come into healthcare specifically. So I showed you those differences by sector, but one of the things about healthcare that keeps coming, you know, back again and again is that it's a global health pandemic. And so I wanted to talk about something I mentioned earlier with the differences within that sector in terms of its recovery. So nursing and residential care facilities has really not recovered very much at all from its pandemic recession job losses, and ambulatory healthcare services completely oppositely has got more jobs now than it did before the pandemic recession happened. And so I was looking here at well, my colleague Anna was looking at this, the distribution of what happened in terms of did they switch employers, did they switch sectors, or are they not found? And in nursing and residential care facilities, again, just like we saw that huge difference with younger workers, see this huge difference in nursing and residential care facilities where they left the sector completely and went somewhere else. Hospitals kept about half of the staff that they, you know, brought them back, and kept about half of the employees that they laid off. And ambulatory care services also was at 43%, so much higher. And I think part of this is really the point in time that we're capturing. We're capturing those early months of the pandemic recession, where nursing and residential care facilities were those hotspots of COVID outbreaks and things like that. And I think it would look maybe a little bit different, particularly for hospitals, if we were looking at a different snapshot of time, if we were looking at what their movements looks like in, you know, the middle or late part of 2021 instead. All right. So we're getting near the home stretch here. And one of the things that we also really wanted to take a look at was not only did these workers find jobs again and where, but what did their earnings look like? Because one of the things that we know from at least 4 decades of research, and I've seen research presented on this by the brilliant LED team. We've seen research from the Bureau of Labor Statistics following the Great Recession, and from all different areas of the country in good economic times, in downturns, in different industries, and in different regions. A job displacement and a spell of unemployment generally results in negative earnings outcomes for those who are displaced from jobs. And so one of the things that is pretty remarkable in terms of this cohort, the pandemic recession cohort, is that 1 year and 18 months after their job displacement, their separation, they'd actually seen real wage gains. And that's in a time when we were starting to see inflation get really high too. So real wage gains for them, 7% a year later and 13% a year later. They actually also outperformed the gains for all workers over that time, which was 3%. And so it seems pretty remarkable because even in a stronger economic time, we went back to the 2016 cohort that I talked about earlier, you know, they had what we would expect. You know, they had seen real job losses a year after, or real earnings losses a year after their separation, and still 18 months later. So the real difference to me seems to be that the stronger wage gains among the pandemic unemployment claimants are a reflection of those unique labor market dynamics that I was laying out earlier. You know, we've had a recovery that's been characterized by widespread hiring, high consumer demand. Those factors have pushed job openings to record or near record levels for a sustained period of time. And that's created this highly competitive hiring environment with higher starting wages during the reemployment period for not only the pandemic recession unemployed, but for all job seekers in Oregon. And so while what happened, the displacement, the distress of losing your job and of the pandemic and of all of that still is there, but it seems that one key difference for this set of unemployed workers is that in addition to all of that hardship, they were not also immediately, at least, exposed to the additional economic scarring of longer term wage losses. And I think that that's a really interesting finding from this as well. And with that, I will put myself back on mute and see if anybody has any questions.
All right, well, thank you, Gail. Before we get to the questions in the Q&A, we received a few questions regarding the presentation, which will be accessible on the Census Academy website in a week or two at census.gov/academy under the webinar tab. Greg has added the link in the chat. So please type all your questions in the Q&A, and at this time, the chat has been disabled to our attendees. So I'll go ahead and read the first question. The first question is, please, can we get more details on the sources of data and the methodologies used to analyze this data?
Yes, so there is an entire section of the full report that goes through all of the methods that we used in terms of looking at not only the labor market environment, but also the claimants themselves. So generally, for setting the stage in terms of what's going on in Oregon's labor market, we're looking at current employment statistics, which is something that we produce here in our division every month. So looking at that for total non-farm jobs, and then also local area unemployment statistics, which is our labor force data, unemployment rates, number of unemployed people. We also get some of those more detailed kind of things that we can utilize, like the share of the labor force that's self-employed. That's something that our local area unemployment statistics coordinator is able to find. And then again, with like the limited English proficiency and some of those other things, those are Census Bureau products, along with the QWI things are obviously Census Bureau products. In terms of the claimants, so that was done using a database that my colleague Anna put together with our IT team here in the agency, so working across divisions, and they built this database where we could link people up by their social security numbers, and we can follow them every quarter. And when we link together what we have on the labor market data side about what employer they worked for, what industry that employer's in, how much they earned, that kind of stuff, if we link that to the other side of the house that says whether or not they were on an unemployment insurance claim, that's where it brings together the pieces where we can go take a look at and analyze that. And during the pandemic era, we did, like I said, we got good data on gender and age for the workers who were in the unemployment insurance system. And so we're able to apply that to what we know about movements across sectors for ages and genders. I hope that that covers most of what they were hoping to find out. If not, the full report, if you go to qualityinfo.org and click on the download publications, there's a full Appendix A that describes most of what I've talked about.
Okay, great. next question is, do we know what areas / industries saw the highest rate of self-employment growth?
I I have every single chance that I've gotten asked about non-employment statistics to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, because it would be really, really wonderful for us to be able to follow up. We don't have any pandemic era data on what that looks like, the non-employer statistics look like by sector, and I am absolutely eager to find out, because especially I've got my eye on professional and technical services, because it was one of, if not the sector with a high share of self-employment or non-employers in Oregon before the pandemic recession. And it's also been one of the fastest growing sectors in this recovery. And it's one of the ones where there was a slightly larger share of workers who disappeared from our wage records that were claimants. And so I really want to pull on that thread, and I don't have the data yet for it.
All right, next question is it known how much brain drain from Oregon resulted from the labor conditions of the pandemic? How many left Oregon to work in another state?
We did not, we attempted to find out. And we don't know if it's, so Oregon tends to be different than other states. I'll just start with by saying that we're a net in-migration state. And actually, that's one of the primary ways that we have grown our labor force, is that on any given year, more people move here than move out. And we have tended, although it's been weaker in recent years, we've tended to have one of the strongest patterns for that of any state in the country. So that typically hasn't been the issue for us, but we still do lose people who take jobs in other states and just move typical stuff. And we've seen our net immigration slow. We did reach out to the Bureau of Labor Statistics because they have a wage record pilot where we can work across states to find where people are if they've left us. And they weren't able to pull the data. So there's confidentiality issues about them then sharing that back with us with an SSN attached so that we can pull it in and follow them the same way. So between timing and some of the data sharing restrictions, we weren't able to get it into this report, but it is something that we tried to look at, and it is something that's out there for all of the states that are participating in that pilot program to explore.
All right, next question is, out-of-state workers who work for Oregon's employers cited in Oregon, ... do they pay Oregon's income tax? And if so, can we keep track of how many fall into this category? Do you need me to
That's a
read that
really
again?
good question,
Oh, good.
and
Okay.
I'm not entirely sure. I do know that so our largest population center in the state of Oregon is the Portland metropolitan area, which does happen to border across to Washington. It's right on the border. Actually, 2 of our metropolitan area counties are actually in Washington. And each of those states has very different income tax setups for the way that people who are residents of those states pay or do not pay income taxes. So I know that those are significantly different, but it's outside of my area of expertise to know what the liabilities are for each of those folks.
All right, and we have one more question. Have you looked at the real earnings gains for UI claimants by the categories of reemployment? Let me get this out of my way, sorry. Reemployment type, same firm, comma, same industry, comma, different industry. One possibility could be that in-person work now pays an earnings premium, in which case industry changers might not see the same gains as people that are re-employed doing the same in-person work.
It is a possibility. It's one that we have not yet explored. We haven't gotten down into that next layer to say, we know that overall what happened to the cohort who lost their jobs in the pandemic recession in terms of wage gains. But we don't know, for example, did the younger workers do even better or not so well? Or did the older workers who went back to the same firm see larger or smaller gains than the younger workers who switched sectors completely? We have not We have not pulled that piece into it yet. And I think it's a really interesting next level to explore, to talk about what those gains could look like for different demographics within Oregon.
All right, well, I don't see any more questions. So with that, I want to thank everyone for joining us this afternoon. And thank you, Gail, for your excellent presentation. Would you like to make any closing remarks?
Thank you, everybody, for the great questions. Thanks again to the Census Bureau and C2ER for inviting us to share this research. And please feel free to reach out to us or to look for more information on our website, Quality Info. Thanks again to everyone.
All right, well, please join us next month, Wednesday, November 16 at 1:30 p.m. EDT, when Moises Yee presents First Quarterly Workforce Indicators for Puerto Rico, provide demographic portrait of island's employment trends. Until next time, thank you for spending your afternoon with us and enjoy the rest of your day.
This concludes today's webinar. Thank you for your participation. You may disconnect at this time.